Welcome to Grappling with a Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I'm Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I'd like to welcome my guests today. With me, I have Professor Pete Alexander, who's adjunct marketing professor at Antioch University, as well as a professional speaker and author on reducing stress in everyday life. Rosemary Revenant is a public relations expert, C-suite presentation coach, and creator of Zoom Score, a yardstick for measuring the essential elements of success. And Catherine Woods is a communications expert, confidence and voice coach, speaker, and speech pathologist. Thank you all for being with me today.
Thank you for having us on
Pleasure.
the show.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you.
And here is today's ethics challenge. In the 2019 movie Yesterday, struggling musician Jack Malik wakes up one morning to discover that the entire world has forgotten that the Beatles and their music ever existed. He records their classic hits as his own and becomes a sensation. But eventually he begins to question whether he is entitled to claim the music as his own. In Jane Hanff Korelitz's novel, The Plot, Jacob Bonner is teaching creative writing at a third-rate MFA program. One of his students submits a manuscript draft with the most brilliant plot Jacob has ever read. When he later learns that the student died without completing the manuscript and apparently without heirs, Jacob steals the plot, publishes the story as his own, and becomes a celebrated author. In both cases, creative works would have been lost to the world if not for the person who appropriated them. Since nobody lost through their misappropriation, did those who misappropriated them do anything wrong? The floor is open.
I'm going to start by saying I don't think that there was anything wrong because there was no intent at the outset to defraud anyone. The person whose work was appropriated is no longer living, and if there was no heir to make claims on that intellectual property, then it was free for someone else to bring to the world and to share that brilliance with an audience. In the case of the movie, well, that's a little bit far-fetched because for us who grew up in the Beatles generation, it's inconceivable that the people are not aware of the vast library and legacy of the Beatles. But in any event, it's that innocence can be forgiven. But I think that if there is, what I think is important is some kind of acknowledgement when they're called on task and they actually acknowledge that it was an innocent error. I think that this is for me a rather a tepid, a rather forgivable breach of ethics.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
The thing I found interesting, at first I thought, well, it's so great that these works are being brought to life in any case. But then what started to bother me at the back of my mind is that I think the individuals that actually brought them out and presented them as their own work have lost something. And I think they've hurt their own integrity. And what if the world lost out because they didn't do what they were supposed to do? They did what someone else was supposed to do.
That's a good point. It's interesting. I had a little bit more for me reading the scenarios. I had a little bit more difficulty with the plot because, as the description says, Jacob steals the plot. So to me, that was full intent. In something like that, from an ethical standpoint, I would have hoped that even if he, publishes the novel, he says this is actually from a certain person's writing that's no longer with us, giving some sort of acknowledgement. But I totally understand why he wanted to have that full record of him for himself, because it might open the door for some other writing opportunities that publishers wouldn't believe that he was capable of. but for, the plot definitely was the one that bothered me more than yesterday, at least the way that it was written up.
That's an interesting point I hadn't thought of, Pete, that there's an element in the story of the plot where it may affect his future writing career and his writing reputation, which presumably would not have been an issue in the case of yesterday, which of course is a complete fantasy. But your point, Catherine, that this is art that the world benefits from having, and therefore there is an element of service to recover it. And since there's no one around from whom it's being stolen, even if we use the word steal, there's no victim here. And that really leads into the broader philosophical question of victimless crimes. Who is the victim of a victimless crime? And the fact that we can't point to one, does that make it okay? Or does that simply mean no laws were broken, but we've still crossed an ethical line? What do you think?
Yeah, the way that you describe that, Unison, I think about, and I'm not an attorney, but when I first read these two, I thought about it from who is being hurt by this, and and I couldn't clearly come up with a scenario where somebody really was hurt, because again, no heirs or nobody knows the Beatles, etc. But does that also mean that the Beatles never, the Fab Four never existed? They, or they just didn't get their music published, where anybody heard it, I think it would be something where getting, for me personally, to have a strong decision one way or the other is to really, peel back as many layers to figure out, is there somebody who has been directly hurt because of this?
Yeah. Go ahead, Catherine.
Yes, and I do think it comes back to also a question as a professor, Pete, how would you feel about stealing work of someone who was a student, even if they were deceased and there was no one around in their family to claim the profits to benefit from this work? At least, like you said, I think that there's an obligation to acknowledge somebody I knew did this, I finished it, and this is a joint effort. And I think by honoring that other individual, you're also honoring yourself and your own integrity, because I think that's where the real damage is done to your own soul or spirit or mind, knowing that that wasn't yours. It must eat away at you.
I would agree with you there, Catherine. Yeah, the last book that I wrote, I remember the publisher said, "You have over 200 sources in this book." And I said, yes, because I'm giving credit to every place that I reference particular information. And, that's why earlier when I mentioned that, noting that this person passed away, but they're the original ones that wrote this, is something that how I would approach it, because, to your point, I need to be able to sleep at night. And, I can't imagine not feeling guilty if somehow I made money off of somebody else's work that they didn't get credit for.
Right. And I think it's having, to Pete's point, having a high level of ethical consciousness. Right? Your standards are so high. You have to give attribution, and certainly in academia, attribution is essential. And it has to be done thoroughly, completely, and in a certain format. It brings to mind an interview that I heard recently with Billy Joel, the prolific singer-songwriter, who comes up with his music. He starts with music first and lyrics second. And sometimes he dreams certain melodies, wakes up and needs to capture the inspiration, but then he wonders if someone else owns it, if he heard it from someone else, not being sure that he dreamt it. So I think he has a very, very high level of ethical awareness. and this sense of authorship, that it's very delicate ground and sacred ground, that when he comes up with something, he has to be absolutely sure that no one else wrote it before him, before he actually pens it and gives it his name. So I think that that's quite an interesting morality tale, that someone of that stature is still so highly tuned into the source of his inspiration.
And as for myself as a teacher and a writer and a scholar, I'll have ideas that I've learned, and then I'll add to them and develop them and expand them. And at some point, I may lose track of what part was given to me and what part did I develop on my own, and trying to hash that out, trying to give credit where credit's due, even if there's nobody around to be hurt by me taking full credit. Is to your point, Catherine, that is the essence of ethics. We've all heard the definition of integrity is doing the right thing when nobody's watching. And that's really what we're talking about here. And I think you mentioned to give credit and say, I mean, again, in the case of yesterday, it's fantasy, but to say that this music was lost. I was fortunate to recover it. I can't explain to you how I recovered it, but I want to honor the people who are responsible for it, or to put an addendum in the front of the book that says, I had a student who came to me with this plot. It was very compelling. He passed away. He never had the opportunity to develop it. And I'm honored to have the opportunity to try to bring his idea to fruition. Then I don't get myself into these kinds of situations where I'm living a lie or I'm compromising my values. Because, the thing about, we mentioned victimless crimes before, the biggest victim of a victimless crime is the perpetrator. Mm-hmm. Because I have now compromised my values. And the chances are, if I do it once, I'm going to do it again. And it's probably going to lead to worse and worse infractions over time.
Mm-hmm. Now, let me add to that, that trust is so linked to transparency and humility. And what you said about giving attribution to that source at the beginning of the book, including some reference to the genesis of the idea. I mean, that's humility, but that's also a sense of transparency that I think adds to elevates the status of the work. It brings it a higher moral consciousness that I think is also imbues a project, with greater value. And I think it takes a very solid person of humility, but also stature to state that publicly. And I think it's commendable.
And I also think by doing that, it's a win-win, because the individual, the author or the artist in either case, is now keeping the lines in their own head really clear. This was someone else, but I still have my own work that I'm trying to bring forth to the world that might also have great value or importance. And if those lines get too blurry, I think you can lose enough of yourself that work, that art, that writing, music could be lost.
Right. Now, I'm going to throw a wrench into this discussion with open AI, artificial intelligence, which now gives the world, and Pete, you're in academia, should know this well, a limitless combination of text and human words that are derived from the best body of work out there on a particular topic, that is difficult to discern whether it is machine generated or human generated. So there you have a whole quagmire of ethical question, right? Where do you draw the line? And that's, I think, is going to give us fodder for a discussion in the future. A lot of interesting conversation.
Yeah.
It has, go ahead, Pete.
Go ahead, Kath. Oh, well, I was just going to say, and AI is also tapping into, or I should say, arming the professors as well, because there is software out there where a student submits a document and you can submit it to the software and run it through a system that'll basically tell you whether or not they plagiarize something without properly sourcing it. So, so yeah, so the AI is on both sides, and it's true. I have a LinkedIn connection who does these interesting tests based on questions that he asks his students, and he asks an AI machine to answer it as well. And he compares the answers that the AI comes with what some of his students answered. And sometimes it's quite interesting, you know, both good and bad, the results of it.
Yeah, AI really opens up a lot of questions, and you know, we'll be revisiting certain scenarios there. But as it gets more and more sophisticated, and as you say, Rosemary, it's harder to tell what's artificially produced and what's human produced. And what happens when we really can't tell the difference anymore?
Well, yeah, there's where it really, it's still pretty bad. All of us are on LinkedIn. It's still pretty bad when you get somebody reaching out to you on the connection and you clearly can tell that it was a bot that sent that message. And you know, I look at something like that and I think to myself, how can the person or the company that is behind that bot be okay with that? You know, and the only thing I can think of is that, well, they get a few people who respond the way that they want to respond, but they don't think about the majority or a big chunk of the group that's going to say, I'm not going to connect with that person.
It's like the Nigerian prince. They only
Yeah,
want the most gullible
yeah.
people responding. Catherine?
Yes. The AI issue is interesting because it brings up something I was thinking about in the world of coaching, for example. There's a lot of information out there, and it can become very murky what's common knowledge and what's not, because so many different wisdoms or sayings and even methodologies can make the rounds to the point where you don't even know who the source was or where you heard it because you've heard it 4 or 5 different places. But at what point, just because you've heard it in a bunch of different places, at what point are you still responsible for keeping track of where it came from? But then when you're hearing it a lot of different places, how do you track that? And if it's great information, do we have an obligation to bring that out? Do we have an obligation to somehow hunt it down? There's things that I know I hear other people saying that are similar to what I say, but not plagiarized. And I always think, I wonder who thought of this first.
You know, it's funny, Catherine, I've done that with whenever I get a quote that I want to share something with, and I'll put it into Google. And it's amazing how the same quote, slight variation, is credited to multiple different people. And I'm thinking, who actually said this, to your point?
It's the blessing and the curse of the internet.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's in the spoken word. I mean, I do a lot of public speaking and I teach people how to be more effective speakers. Now, when you're crafting the messages, you know, you really need to be clear as to what the source is of those statements. And if you're making references to some trend or to some statistics, you really need to dive into the source material so that you're at least your bases are covered, because you don't know who owns it or if it's really true.
Yeah.
Right?
That's true.
There's a wonderful quote by Martin Luther King about anti-Semitism. The first sentence of it is authentic. The rest of it is fabricated.
I'll be darned.
And I've seen it printed in articles by extremely prominent, respected people in respected journals. It's the type of thing that would have been really nice had he said it.
Right. Or quotes that are misattributed.
Yeah.
Right. And it goes on and on and on. I mean, there's so many of quotes that we use in Maya Angelou's is credited with many that she didn't say, but because she used them in her speeches and her poems, she is she's known as the
Yeah,
source.
in fact, I was at a conference and someone quoted Winston Churchill, something to the effect that those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. And a number of us sort of looked at each other and says, Santayana. But I looked it up later. Apparently, Churchill did say it,
Ah,
which is kind of an interesting question because Santayana came first. Maybe Churchill was quoting Santayana. Maybe he came up with it on his own. But is it proper to give credit to someone who may have used a phrase or became associated with a phrase when someone actually brought it into the world earlier?
mhm.
Yeah,
How much
that's a tough
responsibility do we
one.
have?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Yonason, because I remember I had the exact same situation. I used to, for one class, I used to use another Churchill quote that a failure to plan is planning to fail. And then I realized that he wasn't the original one who said it. And so I thought, but nobody is going to know this other person who originally said it. So I actually just swapped it out for a different quote. But it was, I felt horrible that I was quoting somebody who had said it, but had not given proper attribution to the original person who had said it.
We've all heard the Serenity Prayer, right? Which is not from Saint Francis of Assisi, to whom it's attributed. But that's so stuck in my brain. I after looking up several times, I still can't remember the name of the person who actually said it.
Yeah, but you can say you can generally go into that gray area, maybe put in brackets attributed to, widely attributed to, without being absolute. And I think that's again that humility of of knowing what you can own and what you need to yield to. It's really yielding to possibilities that you may be wrong. But generally, it's about, to me, it's really being accountable. It's about doing your homework, not just throwing something out there without having properly researched the source from multiple sources, not just Wikipedia, right? But going to different places to make sure that you've pinned it down, which is part of the research process.
Yeah, and for someone like me who has to look at academic papers, if somebody references Wikipedia, part of my feedback back to the student is you got to find the real source to this, because for those who might be listening, Wikipedia, anybody can put an answer down. Anybody, whether it's attributed or not. So it's not to say that what is on Wikipedia is not true, but when I see Wikipedia as the source, it's like, okay, that must have been the very first thing that came up on your Google search. So
it's a useful tool.
It is.
And it can help you find sources, but then you need to have the discipline to go look up the sources.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're just looking at something like I've used Wikipedia several times. If I'm watching a movie and I see somebody and I go, I've seen that person somewhere before, where have I seen them? And then I put their name in and Wikipedia comes up, and then I see where other movies they've been in. Now I know. That's perfectly fine. But if you're sourcing for an academic paper, it better be referencing in the Wikipedia, it better be referencing an actual true source.
Here's one that came up. Tell me what you think of this. A couple of years ago, I started using the phrase, there's no app for being ethical. And then I put it in papers, and I used it in my keynote, and I made a meme. And then a friend sent me an article that was titled, There's No App for Being Ethical, which predated the time that I started using it. So I started wondering, well, now what's the ethical way of handling this? So I went into a speakers group on Facebook, National Speaker Association group, and I posed the question there. And meanwhile, I've tracked down the author of the article, and I emailed him, messaged him, and I said, I've been using this phrase. I just came upon your article. Do you have any objection if I continue to use this? And, he answered the way I like to think I would have, which is go right ahead. It's not proprietary, but one of the speakers in the group came back and said, from a legal point of view, that when two people arrive at the same idea independently, that there's no issue of infringement of any sort.
Violation of intellectual property.
Yeah, I mean, as long as it hasn't been copyrighted or trademarked or something like that.
Right. And titles of books are not copyrighted.
Right.
So that's why sometimes you do a search for a book and you find multiple titles by different authors. And that's perfectly legal. But of course, it creates confusion, for the reader. But it's acceptable.
Is that the same for movie titles too?
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm curious because
I'm
there's
guessing
lots
it would
of
be.
see those movies that have the same title, and it's like, I mean, we're not talking the big budget ones, but where you put a phrase in and you see several movies with that same title.
Mm-hmm. That's why you see some movies that have a second title, a subtitle.
Mm-hmm.
That helps clarify the search parameters.
Sure.
Yeah, but I think I think back to how it makes you feel. I think we've all talked about something where we inadvertently did something where we appropriated something incorrectly or without prior approval. But I have this childhood memory that guides me with these things. I was like maybe fourth grade, and I did a drawing of a horse, which I traced from another illustration. When I presented it to the teacher, she asked me if I drew it or if I traced it, and I lied. And I said, I drew it. Since that day, when was I, 9 years old or so, I have held on to the discomfort of that memory of having lied bold-faced, to my teacher and traced something that I claimed to be my drawing. And it has never left me. So that's sort of my North Star.
I think that's a really nice point to wrap up on, that, we all make mistakes. We all have poor judgment from time to time, hopefully less when we're 49 and 59 than when we're 9. But it's when we do something wrong, when we violate a principle and we feel that remorse, that can be tremendously powerful in keeping us on the straight and narrow afterwards. And people often complain about biblical stories, how so many figures seem to come across negatively. And why are we admiring these people if they were so flawed? But the point is that not that they were wicked, but they were human, and that human beings have shortcomings and human beings make mistakes. And God doesn't expect us to be perfect. He expects us to learn from our mistakes, to do better, to resolve to do better, and to gradually improve over the course of our lives. So we don't have to look back on times we made mistakes and beat ourselves up over them, but rather to hold on to those points and remember, I know I didn't do right then. I don't want to make that same mistake. I want to get it right moving forward.
It's a really good point that you make, Unison, because what in the research that I've done on stress, not all stress is bad, but what I found was that there were basically 2 areas of stress that were that really do us no good to our mental and physical being. And one of them is exactly what you're talking about. It's called ruminating about the past, beating yourself up about the past. And the reality is, we can't change the past. We can learn from it, positive learnings, and not do it in the future. But if we continue to relive the past and let it churn negatively inside of us, it's not doing us any good. There's plenty of different things we can do if we've got guilt about something we did or didn't do in the past, that we can try and make amends to someone or something for. But to just continue to let it churn, it doesn't do anybody any good.
Right. And today, there's nothing that can be hidden. Everything is discoverable.
Mhm.
So anyone who dares to do some kind of an ethical breach will be discovered at some point. I mean, it's all there, just a matter of knowing where to look. So I think we have to be more transparent, accountable, and have that moral compass, be our guide.
Yeah, and all the more we have to give people grace. That something I did ages ago. Yes, it may have been a violation, it may have been wrong, but I'm not the same person that I was then. And not holding people to unreasonable standards when they may have had plenty of opportunity to have corrected to the extent they can. Catherine, you have a final thought for us?
Just even what Rosemary was just saying brings it right back to the integrity of the individual and just doing your best, because things are find outable with the internet or discoverable, and we always know. We always know. So just like she has beat herself up for years about the tracing of the horse, that's the kind of damage it can do to us when we do something like that, even if nobody finds out.
Yeah,
Indeed, we carry it with us all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll
It
leave off
becomes
with
the subject of the ruminations.
yeah. I'll leave off with a quote I like from Dan Pink that always speak and act like you're with your grandmother, and grandmother has 80,000 Twitter followers.
Or TikTok.
Exactly.
TikTok, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Rosemary Ravenel, Pete Alexander, Catherine Woods. It's been a delightful conversation. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts and your wisdom with us. For those of you who are watching or listening, if you'd like to suggest an ethical dilemma or scenario, please go to my website, jonasandgoldson.com, use the contact information, submit your proposal. If it's something compelling, we will definitely take it up. If you'd like to raise your ethical awareness, you can also go to jonasandgoldson.com/freebie to request a free ebook, infographic, or white paper. Please join us again next week. Actually, next week we're taking off, but there will be an archive episode posted. But do join us in the future for another ethical discussion as our panel grapples with the gray.